Well, Mike Quigley, 2 years ago you suspended the tender process, saying it was all too expensive and you wanted to go with a cheaper alternative. So are you now learning the truth of the old saying that you get what you pay for, because you've had to chuck them off Northern Territory and take that over yourself, and you're running behind?
No, I understand the question, Alan, but the reality is the two are completely disconnected. When we suspended the tender process previously, it was to make sure that we could work with one of the contractors, the construction contractors, to negotiate a way to get the right prices we needed. And we did that successfully. The problems we've experienced and experiencing now are totally unrelated to labour rates, to rates that we're paying our contractors. They're related to mobilisation and getting on with the job.
Well, okay, explain to us the reasons for the delays.
Well, the delays are ones due to mobilisation. There is a learning curve as you begin to roll out into the places all around Australia. Remember, the construction contractors are used to building bridges and roads and the like, and what they're doing is ramping up a learning curve to build this very, very large telco network. What does mobilisation mean? Mobilisation means getting everything that needs to be in place on the ground where it needs to be. That involves drilling rigs and making sure that the requirements and the approvals for entering footpaths and the like are all in place, and making sure that there's enough people on the ground. So that is what needs to be done, and that's what our contractors are now doing. And of course they're climbing up that learning curve, and they're committed to get there. I've spoken to them all again this morning, and we are cooperatively working together to get this network built.
So are you saying that definitely, absolutely, it would have been no different if you'd gone with the more expensive alternative back in 2011?
No, that is absolutely unrelated to this, I can assure you, Alan. It's not related to labour rates or anything like that. It really is related to a learning curve and mobilisation. I have discussions with our construction contractors, the most senior people, on a very regular basis. We talk about the issues. It's not about rates.
So you've cut back the number of homes passed by June by 100,000 to about 200,000. But they're just passed, they're not connected. When will those homes and the rest of them be connected?
Okay, in terms of activation, once we passed a home, then an end user, a person living in a home, calls their retail service provider, who in turn then gives us an order to connect them. What we found is the take-up rates are way above what we had planned. It's simply a myth that the take-up rates on the NBN are low. They are extremely high.
How high? What are they?
Well, they're for places that have been turned on for more than 12 months, they're well above 25%, which is an extraordinarily high number. And in places, for example, such as Kiama and Wollonga, we've got take-up rates that are above 55% now. And some of the places we've turned on very recently, just north here of Canberra, around Gungahlin, the take-up rates there are actually accelerating at a faster rate than even Kiama and Wollonga, which are already at 55%. So the take-up rates are very, very high by international standards, by comparisons with the take-up rates on originally dial-up and then DSL. So it is a complete myth that there's any issue with take-up rates. They're way above what we expected.
Well, that doesn't surprise me, I must say, because it's entirely free.
No, it's not free. The end user has to pay for a service as they're paying for a service today. But what end users are discovering when they get it, it's an extremely reliable service. It's not distance dependent, it's not load dependent, and they get a much better service for the same price as they're getting today.
Now, if the Coalition wins the election later this year, the plan is to turn the NBN into a fibre to the node network instead of fibre to the premises, as you're currently doing. Now, leaving aside whether that's a good idea or not, can you tell us what would that mean to the deal with Telstra?
Well, the deal with Telstra is to build fibre to the premise network. So we negotiated access to Telstra's ducts and pits and exchanges, and also for some dark fibre in the backhaul area, in the trunk area. What we didn't negotiate is rights to use their copper. In fact, that wasn't part of the remit. It would frankly been irresponsible of us to try and do a deal on the basis of a copper which we had no intention of using. And it's also a much more difficult deal to do, I'd have to say. There's many complications in that.
But Telstra is also being paid to decommission the copper. Wouldn't it be just as simple to pay them to buy the copper as to decommission it?
No, because it's not just a question of buying the copper, you also have to maintain the copper and you have to have the IT systems to run the copper, to do all of the activations on the copper and to maintain that copper. It's well known, by the way, that the ongoing operating cost of maintaining the copper is very significant. It's also well known that a fibre infrastructure is much cheaper to maintain than a copper infrastructure. Let me just remind you, if I can, Alan, that in the UK, where there was an attempt to separate out the copper from BT into Openreach, they simply gave up on trying to move those IT systems across. In the end, BT are having to really manage the copper on behalf of Openreach.
So let's be clear. Are you saying that the NBN company couldn't buy the copper from Telstra?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, I mean, anything's possible. I'm just saying it's not simple. I don't know any company, any third-party company in the world that has bought an incumbent's copper and then maintained it and used it. I just know of no build anywhere where a third party has done that. Now, is it impossible? Well, nothing's impossible, but to think that it can be done easily, I think, is a misconception. It would be complicated.
So what other problems do you think would have to be solved if the coalition won the election?
Well, there are the whole issue of the regulatory construct itself. I mean, the deal that we have done with Telstra is the vehicle for structural separation, which means now that the industry can look to NBN Co to be the supplier of a wholesale service on which they can build their retail services, and we're not in any way competing with them. So that whole question about who would control the copper and how would it be managed is absolutely interlinked with the whole regulatory issue. So that's another big issue that needs to be resolved.
But you could presumably solve the regulatory issues by simply buying the copper so that there still existed that structural separation within Telstra.
I mean, in principle, that's true. In principle, what I'm saying is the practicalities of that shouldn't be underestimated. And I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it shouldn't be underestimated. It would be a very, very complex job.
What about the more technical issues? For example, does the copper go to the right places for there to be a fibre to the node network with existing copper?
It's a trade-off always. There's no question that, for example, technologies that use the copper, such as fibre to the node, are being used by incumbents around the world. They own their own copper, so they will try and, as you would expect them to do, to get the maximum use of that asset that they own. So they'll milk that copper, sweat, if you can't use that term, sweat the assets as much as possible. If you're making a big investment in a new broadband network, there is a legitimate question. Do you invest in the existing copper and put tens of thousands of nodes out in the network? And these are boxes that go onto footpaths that are reasonable size boxes with active equipment in them, or do you run fibre all the way to the premise? And there's pros and cons of both of those.
Given what you're saying about the extra cost of maintaining copper versus fibre and the other things, what's your estimate of how much cheaper a fibre to the node network would be than the fibre to the premises one that you're doing now?
Well, you've got to do the calculations. The calculations are really a question of how much do you pay for the copper for start, then how much is it going to cost to put these nodes in place. Then you have the question of what's the ongoing maintenance cost, and it really depends on what period of time you look at. Obviously, there's a higher upfront capital cost for fibre to the premise, but there's a lower ongoing maintenance cost. So you've got to look at the period over time. The other important issue is what are you going to charge for the service? And our product construct in fibre to the premise is a tiered structure for different prices for different speeds, all the way from 12.1 all the way up to a gigabit down and 400 megabits up. With fibre to the node and using VDSL technologies, it's a best effort service. In other words, it's hard to predict what you'll actually get because you're using copper, and even if you remediate it, it's hard really to predict what the service will be. So it's probably a completely different product construct.
You mean you'd have to charge less for fibre to the node?
Well, you'd have to, you couldn't just make the same assumptions that we've made with fibre to the premise, that there's different prices for different services, which you can guarantee, for different speeds, you can guarantee delivering. So what I'm saying, Alan, I guess, it is a completely different business case. that needs to be worked on thoroughly, and there are different trade-offs.
Well, how about a guess? Could you hazard a guess at how much cheaper the fibre to the node network would be?
I wouldn't like to hazard a guess. What I can tell you is what I'm fairly sure of. The upfront capital cost would be lower for a fibre to the node network than a fibre.
Well, how
to the
much
premise.
less? Is it 20%?
No, it could be
10%? What?
could be even more than that. But I'm not going to try and put a number on it. But what I can also tell you, there'll be the fibre to the node network will be a more expensive network to maintain over the long term, because you're using much more sophisticated, if I can say that, technology to try and get the very best performance you can out of that copper, which is an ageing asset. So it's more akin to kind of a mobile network in terms of the amount of processing that you have to do to get the higher speeds.
And do you expect to be the person working with the new minister to solve these problems?
I serve at the pleasure of the board, and it's up to the board to decide whether I'm the right person to do that work.
Well, it's not. So can you be sacked without being paid out of your contract?
No, I mean, like all employees, I have a period of time in which I'm obliged to inform the company if I wanted to leave, and likewise on the other side there's a period of time in which they have to give me notice. But
What is the term?
well, I'm not going to go into the details of my arrangements with the company.
Well, all other CEOs have to disclose their contracts. Why don't you?
Because I think it's probably, I really simply don't want to get into speculation of that sort now. I'm probably happy to put it on the public record, but I really don't want to get into speculation now, Alan.
And are you going to try and persuade Malcolm Turnbull to stick with fibre to the premises?
And what I'm really have been trying to say publicly and encourage some of my colleagues in the industry to get involved in what I think is a sensible debate, so that good policy decisions and good decisions for big infrastructure decisions for Australia can be made on a good, solid, factual basis. And I think that's a good thing to do. My personal view is fibre to the premise is the right answer for the nation. If we're going to make a big investment, you might as well go to the technology that is going to last for decades and decades. Any other technology is inevitably going to be an interim step. And if you're an incumbent who owns the copper, so it's kind of zero cost to you, then it makes sense to use some of those interim technologies. If you are in the situation as we are here, where it's the government building a brand new piece of infrastructure, then I think fibre to the prem is the right answer.
So are you saying that fibre to the node would have to be an interim measure, that it would always have to go to fibre to the premises?
I think everybody appreciates that. You can only squeeze so much out of the copper. We can see with the explosion of video and the demands for take-up, and that's what we're seeing with the people who we've activated. They are using twice as much download than the average fixed broadband user in Australia. So those people on the NBN are using twice as much data because they've got higher speeds and it's working extremely well. I expect that trend's going to continue. It's been happening for decades now in telecoms, as we all know. We remember the old days of dial-up modems, and we're all now reaching for more speeds, and that's what we're finding today.
And was that the purpose of your speech a few weeks ago, to get the industry behind you?
I was trying to get the industry to, because they are the best ones to opine, in my view, on these very complex decisions, and they're not just technical decisions, they're not just about speed, they're about industry structure, they're about regulatory issues, they're about the economics, and they're about the technical and operational practicalities. And there's no one in the country better placed to opine on these issues and to get a fact-based platform there than the telcos.
Thanks for joining us, Mike Quigley.
It's been a pleasure, Alan.